And Natalie, you're a familiar face to NewsHour viewers because you were a guest expert at the beginning of the pandemic, and then you got long COVID. Just tell us how that changed your life.
So long COVID has quite significantly affected me. It's somehow damaged my spinal cord, and so I'm quite limited in my mobility now. I can only walk a small distance and largely with crutches, and then if I need to go any further I use the mobility scooter. It's also affected my bladder and my bowel, and so it's just made life a lot more complicated. And my being about to become a consultant in paediatric infectious diseases, I don't think I can necessarily be the consultant I wanted to be, just because the physical demands of clinical work are just a bit too much for me at the moment.
Right, so it's clearly, in your case, turned out to be, on the face of it, career limiting.
Yes, I would say so. I think I'm one of the fortunate ones in that I have actually been able to return to work because a lot of the work I do is research, and I can do that from home. But many of my colleagues have lost their jobs entirely and are now on benefits and having to use food banks because they haven't been able to continue in their careers.
And do you think a lack of adequate, decent PPE is part of all this?
Yes, most of my colleagues are of the belief that they've contracted COVID at work. I know that I contracted COVID at work because I was single and living alone and driving to work at the time when I got COVID, and I was sharing an office with someone who tested positive for COVID the following day, and a few weeks later, or a couple of months later actually, I then contracted COVID again whilst working on a COVID ward with just a surgical mask. I know I didn't have any exposure outside of work. And the same is the case for many of my colleagues. While obviously it's difficult if they had exposure outside of work to say it definitely happened at work, we do know that the bulk of NHS workers did actually contract their infection at work, especially those who had no family at home who might have been unwell. And we know that they probably had quite a high viral exposure dose purely by not having appropriate PPE and being in contact with someone who was acutely symptomatic with COVID, and caring for them in close proximity.
Right, now you are joining this move for legal action. Who precisely do you intend to sue?
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think that the answer to that will come out as more work is done investigating exactly who made the decisions. Obviously, there's the individual NHS trusts, but they were following guidance that was provided to them. The question is who gave them that guidance and where did it originate? We know that certainly from about April time of the pandemic, if not earlier, there was a group called the Infection Prevention and Control Cell, or the IPC cell, which was part of the NHS pandemic strategy. Unfortunately, unlike SAGE and NervTag, the IPC cell membership has never been made public and their minutes have never been made public. So we've only been able to access a few sets of minutes through Freedom of Information requests. But obviously it remains a relatively elusive body, and we don't understand their decision-making process and why they set the guidance as they did. So part of this legal action is to try and ascertain that situation.
And do you, your lawyers saying that they think that you can be successful in this?
Yes, they do believe that we can be. They have a strategy. I'm not party to that at the moment, but they do believe that we can be. But I think for a lot of us, it's not a matter of money. It's about understanding why the decisions were made, and also understanding why the PPE guidance hasn't changed despite us now having a lot more scientific understanding and evidence about the airborne spread of COVID. Even though I'm of the opinion that we knew that early on, we certainly can't dismiss that we know that now, and yet the PPE guidance is the same now as it was in April time of 2020. So I think we have questions as to why the guidance hasn't changed, particularly when there is widely available FFP masks, so higher grade PPE now. It's not like during the first few months of the pandemic when there were shortages. Why has the guidance not changed? And why are we not hearing who the IPC cell are and what the decision-making process was? Because as it stands at the moment, if we were to have another pandemic tomorrow, we would be making exactly the same mistakes again.